Thomas here. This video is about how to disassemble the trigger assembly on the Browning Double Auto. And the first step is to get the trigger assembly out. I've got here a double auto with the barrel and the furniture removed, which is pretty easy to do. But when you go to take the trigger assembly out, first step is the bolt must be forward. And if you don't have it forward, it will slam forward when you pull it out. So first steps first, put the bolt forward. If you have a double auto, you probably know how to do this, but you want to latch onto the bolt handle with a finger, flip it underneath, and press on this, which is the carrier latch. And then that allows the bolt to go forward, just like so. So that's step one. The next step is not obvious. How do you get this out of here? Well, I found out by watching someone else's video, so kudos to that guy. But here it is, right in here. There are two pins, one right there and one right here, and they need to pull straight back out of the gun. And it is not easy to do, especially the first time you do it. What you have to do is take a screwdriver. There's two little notches on both of these pins. They're not really pins, they're more like rods. I think the official name is Fastening Guide. But anyway, you come under here, and you need to be careful you don't bind up on the spring, but you kind of find your way and do a prying motion out. And you might want to put some electrical tape on here if you want to be careful with your finish here. I've done this a couple times, so it should be fairly easy for me. Ooh. Okay, prying motion, and you can see it's on the other side, but it's starting to come out right there. And once you get it out a little bit, you can just pull it straight back. And if you're doing this at your place, it'll probably be a lot harder. This has been out a couple times. So just be patient, work with it. They should come out. You might end up applying a lot of pressure. You might have to get a stronger screwdriver than this, but they will come out. So now it's time to get the other one. Yeah, this one's, okay, there it comes. Yeah, there it comes out. Yeah, this one's actually, looks like it's finger tight, which is nice. Okay, now this is the longer one. The one on the left side is longer, and it's going to bind up a little bit on your action tube as you pull it out, but that's okay. Now you have both of these out. The fastening, they're called the Fastening Guide. Left is the long one, and right is the short one. I happen to have another double auto, so I'll show you some other fastening guides. You can see these two have a little bit different notch. So if you are taking it apart, it's good to know what the notch looks like. I don't know which one your shotgun would have, but these two are a little bit different than these two. These two are actually easier to take out because the little notch is easier to get onto. So that's that part. Once you have that out, the trigger assembly will pull straight down. You might have to jiggle it a little bit. Some are tighter than others. Then also the shell latch here, you might have to kind of release that as well, but it should pull straight down, more or less. And there it comes. Now the trigger assembly is out, and onto the main part of this video, which is about how to disassemble it. First things first, it might help to just take a really good look at it. Sometimes when you're working on guns, you just need to know how it's put together. So this is an intact Browning Double Auto trigger assembly. There's this side, top. So maybe you just have that one component you need to know where it goes. That's what it looks like. But about to dive in how to disassemble it. First step is to release the hammer. So make sure your safety's off and put your thumb on the hammer and release it. oops, safety was on. Safety off, release the hammer, let it go forward. That's step one. Step two is to go ahead and take off, let's see, what's best to do next. The carrier here would be the next thing to do. And what you need to do is push this back, push this spring back, and it should come out. Let me zoom in on that. Come on, focus. That doesn't want to focus. There. Okay, so you need to pull this back, and then that will allow this spring to come out and the rod and spring to come out. It's not that easy to do with a regular screwdriver. You can do it. It's probably what you have, but I'm going to show you another tool. If you happen to have it, it makes life a lot easier. If you have a bit that looks like this, that can make taking these springs on and off a lot easier. Gives you a better way to grab on both sides of it. But I'm going to try it with a screwdriver because it's probably what you have at home. Okay, first steps first, push this back, and hopefully you're not going to launch it. Yeah, it does require quite a bit of pressure to pull it back. There. Okay, now it's out of its little hole it seats into. So now I'm going to kind of pry it off, and hopefully it will not fly across the room. There. So that came out, and that allows the carrier to come out fairly easy now. Let me zoom back out. So now if we press on that side of the pin there, right in there, if you press on that, this pin will come out. So we just push that on out. There, it popped out, and now there's the carrier. Carrier came out. And the carrier itself can be disassembled further. It's not that hard to do. There's a spring here and a pin that should just push out. I'll go ahead and disassemble that just for grins. Okay, there it's pushing out, and hopefully it won't launch. Okay, there, gently pulled it apart. So there we have this part as well, and the pin that puts it together. So that's how you completely disassemble the carrier. Not too bad. So now we're back to, we'll push all these aside and get back to the trigger. So the next step with the trigger would be to take the hammer out. And first, you need to take out the hammer springs. Kind of an interesting arrangement. There are two hammer springs, one on each side of the hammer, and it's going to be similar to taking out that carrier spring. You need to push each spring back far enough to get it out of its little alignment hole there, and then it can come out. So I'll try it, yeah, with the fingers here. Let's see here. If I release some tension with the fingers, and then, yeah, kind of just pull it out. There, it's out. Okay, there's one hammer spring and its guide rod. Now time to do the other hammer spring. What I'm doing is I'm pulling on the spring just to release some of its tension, and then helping with the screwdriver to push it all the way back. And yeah, pull some of that tension off, get in there with the screwdriver. Yeah. Okay, and careful, you don't want them to go flying across the room. So there we have both the hammer springs out, and now the hammer is free to come out. It's like the other two things we just took out. well, there's another part here that goes through the hammer. I think it's called the stirrup, something like that. But this is what both of these hammer springs seat into. So that comes out of the hammer. And then we can take the hammer out itself by pushing on this pin here, and it goes out in just one direction. Push on that pin, that falls out, out comes the hammer. So that's it for taking the hammer out. And if you have to replace a spring or something, maybe that's as far as you need to go. The rest of the trigger assembly is mostly the trigger mechanism here. And it's a little bit different. Let me zoom in on it. It's already starting to come apart here. This is what the springs go through on the other side. And the rods will push through this piece here. So we take that out, put it aside, and then this, I don't think that's quite ready to come out. Let me see. So take your punch and push out the trigger pin right through here. I don't think you should have to pound it. It should push out, at least on the two Browning autos I've worked on. It just pushes out. And there it is, the trigger pin. Now these parts are free to come out. It might be a little, yeah, they just kind of fall out. There's one part, I think that's might be the Seer. And you can see in here the spring. It's the trigger spring down in there. And this was one of the mysterious things that's kind of different. This trigger spring actually goes through a hole in the trigger itself, and it's got a little plunger and seating mechanism back there. So this spring, I believe, you just pull it forward. Kind of pushing on this side to get it through there. Oh, it looks like the whole trigger the whole trigger can come out right now, so that you can just pop out. But you see how that spring is oriented. It goes through the trigger. Kind of different. And this part here can come off. I did take it off once. If you're going to take it off though, be careful, because you will have to you pound out this pin. You'll have to pound that pin out. It won't just come out. And there is a spring and plunger in here that you need to make sure you keep captured, and it comes out. It's not too bad. Then when you put it back together, you need to pound this over to make sure it stays seated. It's got a little pressure there. Actually, I'm going to take that apart. I always hate videos where you see, oh yeah, this is no problem, don't worry about it. So I'm going to take it apart. So I've got my little block here, and you do want to look at this pin. Whichever side is flared more, you want to go to the other side and pound on that side. So this side has less of a flare, so I'm going to knock it out in this direction. And I will need a hammer. Got my hammer, going to go ahead and pound that out. It's going to be a little bit difficult, not like the other pins. There, it popped out, and I need to make sure I keep things captured here. Not too bad, nothing flew across the room. So that is almost completely disassembled, almost. Here's the trigger again. I don't know what this is for. I can't figure it out. And I actually have a second trigger assembly. This one is, I believe, a newer trigger assembly, I think. But you'll notice this one has two pins here. This one does not. If you look in the top, I don't know why this one has that part there. So I don't know what that is. I don't know why it's there. It does come out. And I'll just, in case you have one with this part in here, I'll take it out. I'll I'll take it out, just have a look at it, and it will go right back in exactly like it came out. So this one needs to be tapped out as well. It's not something you can just push out. Coming out. So anyway, here's that part. Should pop out now. There it goes. Okay, it does pop out. And I have no idea what that part is or what it's there for. And like I said, on this trigger assembly, it's not in there. Maybe this makes it more reliable? I don't know, but even in the diagrams, I don't see it in any of the diagrams. That is very odd. So anyway, there's, get this rest of this pin out of there. Guess my punch is just not, there it goes. My punch is not long enough to get that out of there. Now, this is almost completely disassembled. There's one more part that can come out. Let me push some of this out of the way. The safety, which, what the heck, as long as we're taking it completely apart, let's take the safety out too. Now the safety, you can see on the left side, there is a round hole. Zoom in on that. There's a round hole on this side, and if you flip it around to the other side, it looks a little squared off. Pretty sure. Let me take a closer look at that with the magnifier. Well, I checked it out with my magnifier, and it turns out both sides are rounded off. I was thinking of my other trigger guard where one side had a little bit of a square to it, but both sides are rounded off. What you're going to want to do is look at each side, and there might be one that's a little bit more flared. If you find that, you want to go to the opposite side and tap it out from that direction. So this one looks to be not quite as flared as the other side, so I'm going to go ahead and tap it out from here. This punch is just barely the right side. I think it's a, let's see, what size is this punch? A 1/16 punch. And it just barely fits, it looks like. I think that's, my punch is just a little bit too short there. Anyway, it looks like it's about ready to come off there. No, well, there it goes. Okay, so that popped off. So there we go. We pulling the safety assembly apart. This pushes through the trigger right there. It looks like we're going to end up with 3 parts. Try to get that pin out. It's probably not that important. There it goes. Okay, so now we have the safety parts. This looks like it could be disassembled further, but that's kind of an assembly. Came from the factory like that, and like if you buy a replacement part, you would get the whole little assembly here. Looks like these are rollers. Yeah, rollers. And then this is connected to that part. Yeah, that's a complete assembly though, so we're not going to disassemble that anymore. And you've got the pin and the finger part, the part your finger goes on. So there we have it. With that coming out, that is a completely disassembled trigger guard. And I'm gonna lay out the parts here before it goes back together. So here I have the trigger assembly completely disassembled and just laid out on the workbench here. And the schematic there, it's really hard to see. It's very fuzzy. There's just not very much good information on the Browning double auto shotguns out there, but I'm going to do my best to identify some of these parts. Of course, we have the trigger guard here, and then we have our safety parts over here. Let's see what these are called. This is the safety finger piece, the safety retaining pin right there, and then this is the safety spring assembly. So that does come all together as one part. And over here we have the mystery parts. I still don't know what that is. If you know what that is, please leave a comment on the video. I'm very curious about why it's there and why it's not in my other trigger guard. And up here, I think I got the name for this wrong earlier. Let's see, this is the Seer, the trigger, of course, and the disconnector. So that makes this the disconnector. No, not the disconnector spring. The Sear Spring. So that's the Sear Spring, and then the Sear Spring guide that goes with it, and that goes. Put it back together. That goes through the trigger. Kind of an odd arrangement there, but it goes right through the trigger. And then, of course, we completely disassembled the disconnector up here, so it has its pin and its plunger and its spring. Ah, this thing's magnetized. Come on. So that's the plunger, spring, and the pin for the disconnector. And this is, of course, the trigger pin here. And this is the Seer pivot. This is what these hammer spring guide rods go through. And of course we have the hammer over here, 2 hammer springs and 2 hammer spring guides, and the hammer pin. And this is not called a stirrup, it's called a yoke. I think it's called the hammer spring yoke, official name. And up here, of course, we have the carrier, and this assembly here, this is the carrier dog, and you've got the carrier dog spring, the carrier dog spring guide, carrier dog pin, and of course the carrier pin itself, and that's all activated by the carrier pin spring and carrier's spring guide. So I think that's the proper naming for all these parts. It's kind of hard to tell. You can go on Numerich and look at their really fuzzy diagram. Maybe buy a proper diagram off eBay. But that's what I got here. Time to put it back together. Starting with the safety. So we've got our trigger guard here, safety spring assembly. And I do want to note one thing I did with this safety spring assembly. It was a little loose in the gun. Not bad, just a little loose. So what I did is I took my needle nose pliers and I bent these springs slightly. I bent them each kind of back down this way a little bit with the pliers. And that should give it a little bit more tension when it's inside the trigger guard. We'll see how it works out. These, normally, every time I try to bend something on a gun, it breaks. But this is spring steel, so I figured it'd be safe, and it didn't break. Do it at your own risk. They are available. I saw them on Numerich for $13. So if you do break it, you probably have an out, but probably best to leave it alone unless your safety just isn't working. And maybe that would revive it. So the next step is to put the spring assembly, safety spring assembly, into the trigger guard. And then we need to get the safety finger piece on there and then get this pin through it. That can be tricky, especially I put some more spring tension on this from what I did, so I'll probably have to apply some pressure with my thumb. I've had pretty decent luck using this 1/16 inch punch as a slave pin. We'll see how it works and see if I can capture that here on camera. Okay, there, it looks like it became a slave pin. This represents a lot of tries off camera, so if it takes you a little while to get that on there, don't be discouraged. It took me a lot of time too. So next, this pin needs to go through there. Yeah, we're not home yet. So put this in there. I think because the other end's a slave pin, this should go back on fairly easily. Now with the hammer, I'm going to lightly tap it on this side. And it looks like it's seating, which is really good to see. I'm going to get a slightly larger punch and tap it in some more. Actually, I need a bigger punch than that. Here we go. This is a nice, safe size punch. Put it on this end and tap a little bit more. My fingers are going to cover it up, but just tapping this pin in with the hammer. Okay, well, looks like the no longer need a slave pin, which is nice because I can put this onto my block here and give it a little something to push off of. It's nice to have that. Yeah, that's a good resting spot for that. This is supported on the other side, and I will grab my punch here and send it home. Okay, it looks like it's in place there. Should be in there solidly, and let's check out the operation. Oh yeah, that's better. It's got more tension just from bending it ever so slightly with the needle nose pliers. So that's a win. Yeah, loose safety is not a good thing. Okay, so the safety's back in. As long as we're looking at the safety here, and I have a second double auto, I just wanted to show a few of the differences that can pop up. Like I mentioned earlier, this one is pretty much rounded on both sides right here. And this other trigger guard has kind of a squared off, flattened side of the pin. It's a flat side. Now the other side is round, but this side is flat. So when you go to take this pin out, you definitely want to pound from this side. And when you put it back in, you definitely want to put the pin in this way, because this is not going to want to fit through the hole. That's kind of what's keeping it in place. Now to put the trigger assembly back together, which includes the disconnector here. And it goes in this positioning, and this pin and the spring, this plunger all need to go underneath to put it back into its assembly. So first things first, we need to take the spring and the plunger, get those put back together here. And with that assembled, that goes into trigger here. There's a hole right there. It goes in there, and that presses in and out there. Now the next part is the really tricky part. This needs to go onto here. You need to press the plunger down, line it up with the hole there, and get the pin through that hole. It's not easy. The best I could come up with is, first steps first is to get this pin started at least into the disconnector itself. And to do that, what you want to do is this one does need to be seated properly, and it's going to need to be peened so it won't fall out, definitely. So figure out which side of the pin is not flared. Basically, whichever side you punched it out with, that side needs to go back in first. So this is going to go back on like this. It's going to go back on like this. So I'm going to start this pin on the other side of the disconnector. Flip that over and let's see. Get the non-flared side of the pin and get it started. Hopefully that shows up on camera. Get it started right on this side. And that's in there a little bit. I'm going to give it a tap just to get it seated. Now you don't want it poking all the way through, but it would be nice to have it almost poking all the way through. And maybe a few more taps. Okay. So there I've got the pin started. Looks like our plunger ran away here, so that needs to go back into the trigger assembly. Now the tricky part is to get this on here and then be able to hammer on this pin here. Hammer that into place, but it all needs to be held together in the proper orientation. So what I found a little trick. Hope it's going to work. First off, you need to get that plunger down and you need to get the holes lined up. And my punch, I was going to try to use my punch as a slave pin. It's too small. But this is a hammer guide rod, or the hammer spring guide, one of them, and that seems to be about the right size. So I'm going to put that through there and use it as a slave pin. So now the tricky part is to hold it together like this and hammer that pin in. It's going to be hard because it's not supported by anything. So I'm going to try this. A little unorthodox, but I'm going to try it. So now I have something to hammer against. That went through my little block there. So now I can hammer on that pin. And it might be going in. I think it's going in a little bit here. I think it's going in. So I got started at least. Now I just need to get it the rest of the way in there. It's getting there. So far so good. So maybe it just needs a few more good whacks to get through there. Yeah, that's in place. Excellent. Okay, well that's a good trick. You can use the hammer guide, the hammer spring guide, as sort of a slave pin on the other side to help you get it started. Now that it's in place, this next step is not optional. You need to make sure it stays in place. And to do that, the side of this pin needs to be flared a little bit. The way to do that is to put something metal and unmovable on this side, then use a bigger punch and whack on the pin on this side and to kind of make it mushroom over. The reason for that is this pin definitely needs to be captured. That's the only thing that's going to be holding the pin in. You know, it needs to pivot, so it can't be in there solid. It does need to pivot, but it needs to not fall out as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go I have a vise that can supply a place to hit on the other side. So I got to grab that real quick. This side is not mushroomed over, so I'm going to need to seat that. This vise will provide a nice, very heavy or very rigid surface. And I'm going to take this big punch, go on top of it here, going to pound it really hard with this big hammer, and it should mushroom over there. I don't think I can do that on camera, so I'm going to have to switch off for a second. I just pounded it pretty good. It looks like I have a nice little flare there, so this should not be popping out. It should be nice and captured. Okay, before going any further, you need to make double sure this is moving smoothly. You might have noticed in that last clip I had it pulled back here and it got stuck back there. That's not good. This should move back and forth freely with no problems. Should be pretty smooth. If it's not smooth, you need to do what you have to do to get it there. Maybe you got the pin too tight somehow. Maybe this got squeezed together. Maybe it's binding up in here. Maybe that you need to do some gunsmithing and smooth these sides out just so it can move freely. But whatever you do, you need to make sure that's moving freely. Next up here is getting the trigger and the sear, along with the spring and pin, all into the trigger guard. It's a little tricky just because of how it's set up. It's a little different too. The guide, of course, goes into the spring here. This is actually the Sear Spring. It's not the trigger spring, it is the Sear Spring. That goes like that, and that goes through the trigger. There's a hole in the trigger, and that goes through the trigger. And once it goes through the trigger, it goes here into the sear. And there's a little hole for the spring to seat in. That goes in there, and then all of this kind of gets mushed together and needs to go down into the trigger guard. And of course, you can't just stick it down in there. Nothing's that easy. So the way to put it together is to take the trigger and the guide, and you put the guide to the trigger like that. It cannot pull all the way through, which is nice. And then you take this without the spring and you put it into the trigger guard, and it just goes right in there. And there's a place here you need to line up the pin. The pin needs to go in here lined up with the trigger. And another trick, it is a little tricky to do that. So just like with the Seer, here's what I was looking for. This right here. This is the Sear Spring guide, and it's going to be used as kind of a cheater pin to get this started. But first things first, like I was saying, the plunger goes into the trigger right here. And then, once that's in there, you put the trigger into the trigger guard. And the trick is to line up this hole with this hole and get the pin through it. And the easiest way I've found to do that is the Sear Spring guide. Get the holes mostly lined up. It's smaller than the pin, and just kind of work it in there until it seats and goes through. There it went through. So the trigger's in there. It's loose, but that's good. So then you take the trigger pin itself and go to the other side and push it through right here. And that's just going to get pushed out like a slave pin. And it will take some jiggling because that temporary slave pin was too small. There it goes. And it goes through, and take a punch and just push it down so it's flush. It might take a little pounding, probably not, but it just needs to be flush in there. And this pin, it will be captured when it's inside the receiver, so it's not critical that it's seated extremely tight. I am gonna tap it just a little bit on this side. Just make sure it's seated there. Okay, well, with a little help from the Sear Spring guide, we got that trigger in there. Now the next step, we do need to get both the Sear and the Sear Spring in there. And I found that it's easier to do it this way. You look down in here and you can see the guide here. So what you do is you just take the spring, just like so, and you put it on the guide from here. Or actually, it gets pushed through, and you put the spring through the hole here, and it ends up getting aligned onto the guide. Pretty straightforward. This next part is the little bit trickier part. The spring needs to seat inside this hole on this side, and the spring's already in there. So with a little help from a punch or a screwdriver, you need to kind of work it around so that spring can get into this hole. It's not that hard. It's the easiest way I've found, but it does take a little finagling here. I'll see if it works out on camera. Hopefully it will. There it went. Okay, so the spring is seated in there, and then this needs to come forward. In the Seer, pull this back, pull the disconnector back, and the Seer can go in a little bit further. And it needs to go in and down. The Seer does. So it should end up seated kind of down in there, and it should kind of click into place. Once that's in place, the next piece to go in is called the Seer pivot. It's this piece here. And it goes right through here, like this. And depending on how well the Seer is seated, will tell you how easily this will go in. It's not going, so that means the Seer needs to be positioned a little bit better. Probably has to be pushed down. Maybe push it back and down. Yeah, I think that's a little bit better positioned. This goes in just like a pin. There, it must be in good position because it went across. That can be a little tricky. What I did is I kind of pushed it back and down, and it seated in a little bit better. And you can see the Seer pivot here. There's a flat side, and the flat side needs to be on this side. With that in, the next step is to put the hammer in. We've got the hammer. We've got the hammer pin, and then we have both the hammer springs with their guides, and that's the next piece to put in. And the other little important piece here is the hammer spring yoke. And actually, Browning calls these main springs, not hammer springs, but they're hammer springs. They operate the hammer. So make sure you have your guides inside your springs, and these are going to be installed in that direction when they get installed to the hammer. First step is get the hammer in there. It's very easy. The hammer pin goes through the bottom hole. So you get this in here. Hammer pin goes down through the top, like so. There's only one way you can put it in, so don't worry about messing it up. It goes in and it goes flush. So there you have that. The next thing you're going to need is the yoke. And the yoke has a flat side as well. See the flat side here? The flat side needs to point that way. And that's because these springs are going to go into these little holes here, line up just like that. So the yoke goes right through here. And try to get the flat side pointing this way. It's not super critical at this point because they'll kind of get put into position. Now the next part is a little bit tricky. You need to take this spring and put it in between the yoke and the Seer pivot. And what you need to do is it needs to start going into the Seer pivot. And then I found the easiest thing to do is pull back on the spring, relieve the tension, and then see if you can guide that into the hole here. Now I got it mostly there. It didn't click into place. So I'm going to try and work it a little bit, relieve the tension, and it looks like the yoke needs to spin just a little bit. If I can make it happen with a screwdriver. No, just needed my fingers there, and that's in place. One of the hammer springs is in place there. Time to put the other one in. Now that was unnecessary. I just cocked it with one spring just to see what would happen, and it worked. But it's time to put the other spring in, which should be a little bit easier because we got one in already. So start on the sear end. Start on the sear end. There should be a little, it should poke out a little bit here. Get it into the sear pivot hole. Pull back on the spring to release the tension. And part of the difficulty is getting this back into the sear pivot. See, it's not wanting to go quite yet. There, it went. Well, I think it went. No, not yet. Oh, look at that. The yoke's falling out a little bit. Have to push the yoke back into place. So, try again. Just need to get that to push into the sear pivot. There it goes. Okay, it's almost in there. Need to just bring it home. Need to just bring it home and get this into its little hole here. So I'm going to relieve tension and just try to manipulate it in there. Very close, very close. Yeah. Blew it. Yeah, it's a little tricky. And this is where, actually, this might be a good place to bring out my magic tool. This thing. This is the thing that makes it very easy. Actually, I'll finish up without it, but if you have this, oh, it's easy. You just get on either side, push it back in, and it seats so easily if you have that tool. But I'm going to soldier on with just screwdrivers and punches here. So try again. Going first into the sear pivot there, relieving the pressure. The trick is to get it to push down into the sear. There it goes. Now the yoke's not through anymore. There it goes. Push this back. Now I just need to get that over to the yoke. The yoke kind of needs to be pushed back there. Finagled it around enough and it's seated. But it's now in there solid. Not going anywhere. And time to function test it. I did so a little earlier. Do it again here. Hammers back. Hold the thumb here. Pull on this. And of course, this should be free. That should be moving freely. Make sure that still moves freely. And that's a quick function check. Safety, safety off, hammer down. So that is almost complete. So we have just a few parts left. The next step is to assemble the carrier here. It's kind of a sub-assembly. So we need to get the carrier dog onto the carrier, and it has a spring and a plunger here. So let's put the, or I guess that's a spring guide, not exactly a plunger. So we put the spring onto the spring guide, and this carrier dog will be going on just like this. And the spring lives in between there, and then we put the pin in. So take it apart here. Get the spring into this hole here. Might need a little zoom. Put the spring into this hole here. Now the guide is curved, and it'll be obvious how the curve will need to go like that. So we'll put that in there. And on this side there is a little tiny hole right there. And this end of the guide is going to go into that hole. And then once we get it all together, we put this pin through and it will be assembled. Let's see how easy that goes. Okay, spring and spring guide in there. This goes into that hole. It's into that hole there. And this comes, put some tension on it to get this down to here. And this is the pin, the smaller one. This is the pin, it's the smaller one, and it needs to go in on this side where it can sit flush. So it's a little bit of a trick holding everything here together. I'm going to try putting the pin on top, moving it back, hoping it's just going to fall in there. It could. There, fell in. And there's the carrier dog on the carrier. Looking good. Now, the carrier needs to go onto the trigger guard. Just got a few parts left here. We're going to do the last step, which seems very simple, but is actually pretty tricky. We put the carrier back onto the trigger guard. And in theory, it's very simple. This goes back into its position here. We put the pin and the spring in, and we're done. In practice, it's a little tricky. So first off, it's easier if you have the hammer cocked, and might as well put the safety on if you're cocking the hammer like that. And then the carrier, just to fit it, it's going to go on just like that. And you can see the hole here on the other side where you line that up. You put the pin in, and if you had the spring in there, you'd be done. But it's tricky to get that spring in. So the way I found to get the spring in is to use the carrier itself as a compression tool to compress the spring. And it's tricky, no two ways about it. The first step is to put the spring onto its guide, just like that. And this spring and guide are going to fit into the trigger assembly here. They're going to go, there's a hole right there, the end here, and this is going to seat right in there on one end, and on the other end there is a hole in the carrier right there on this end. It's going to seat in here like this. So it's going to be right in here, just like so. So easy to do, right? So anyway, I use the carrier itself to compress this spring, which even with that, it's tricky. So I'm going to try and catch it here on camera, how I do it. First of all, you have to kind of get that spring seated there. Then you grab the carrier, and using it as a tool, get it in the hole there. You need to compress that spring. The real trick is to get that spring to go through the hole. Hey, there it went. Wow. Believe me, it is not that easy. And I misspoke. To get this, not the spring through the hole, but actually the guide through the hole. It needs to be able to poke out on this side, and I got very lucky. Believe me, it's usually not that fast, but I'm glad I have it on camera. You use the carrier to push it back. You're not done yet. You're almost there. Now you have it captured. You use the carrier, push it down. It should be flat down there. And the carrier is basically in its position. But the last step you need to do is you need to get the pin in. And with the carrier, you're going to have to move it into position, but you've got pretty good leverage with the carrier. So what I found you need to do is you bend it all the way down like that. Put the pin in here, get the pin in there, and then bend it down until you can seat it. And it might not be that easy. So you might want to line it up. There, it's lined up. I'm kind of putting pressure, pushing it back a little bit here. Yeah, you can see where it's lined up, but the trick is to have the pin in there as you get it lined up. There he did it. And voila, that is a completely reassembled trigger assembly for the double auto. Nice. Very nice. Just testing it out. The carrier goes up and down. Got your carrier dog. Disconnector, nice and smooth there. Safety works, safety off. Pull the trigger, the hammer goes down. It's working. Now another thing you can test is when you pull the trigger, when you pull the trigger, this should be down, and the hammer can come down. It should be captured. You let go, there's a reset, and when you pull the trigger, yeah, it fired. That's so you don't go full auto with your double auto. Call that done. And the final step here, might as well do it. Put the trigger back into the receiver here. There's two little notches. This just goes right in here like this. I'm pushing down on the carrier latch right there. Just got to get these guys lined up. Push this home. Finally, in go the fastening guides. The long one goes on the left, so it goes right in here. They can be a little tricky to line up. Like this is actually a very odd method. Put a shotgun together. I think that's lined up. I'm gonna push with this so I don't hurt my thumb. Maybe I'm not lined up. I think that's going. Ah, yeah, it's going. Ouch. Okay, so slide that in there. I don't think you need a punch to put that in. Yeah, okay, I'm gonna come back and seat that the rest of the way here soon. Put this on this side here. And that goes. Wow, I don't want to go in there. Let's see what that's about. Okay, there it goes. Ah, ouch. I hate it when that happens. Anyway. Okay, so they're going in. Okay, ease in, and this guy. It's like I'm going to have to tap him in. Hate to do that, because that means it's a booger to get out, but you gotta do what you gotta do. Just tapping it lightly, not hard at all. There it is. Trigger guard's back in. Done deal. One final observation, as long as I'm doing this long video, these two trigger guards were slightly different, as noted, and one of the differences here, one of them is just slightly longer than the other. Kind of odd. Maybe a 1/16 of an inch longer. Kind of strange. Don't know why, they just are. So, that's it for the Browning double autos. If you happen to get this far, please leave me a message, leave me a comment. Love to hear from you. There's not many people that work on Browning double autos, and it'd be fun to hear from someone that actually watched this video. Appreciate it.